138 earthquakes struck the southern Philippines in a single morning, not over a week, not over a day, one morning. The largest of them, a magnitude 7.8, brought down a school, cracked open roads, killed dozens of people, and sent a wall of seawater onto the coast of Mindanao. And then it kept going, firing off aftershock after aftershock, 3 of them above magnitude 6, while a monitoring station meant to watch it all simply went dark. By the time you read this, the headlines have already moved on. The tsunami threat, they say, has passed. But the people who study this fault for a living are not watching the rubble. They are watching the rock, and they are watching a clock most of us never even knew was running, because the most dangerous hours of an earthquake like this are often the ones that come after the cameras leave. So what exactly are they seeing that the rest of the world stopped looking for? Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and drop a comment to tell me where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. Part 1. The morning the ground came apart. At 37 minutes past 7 in the morning, on Monday, June 8, 2026, the seafloor off the southern coast of Mindanao moved. Not gently, and not for long. In the space of less than a minute, a slab of the Earth's crust roughly the size of a small country slipped past another slab it had been locked against for decades, and the energy that released through into the surrounding rock was enough to make a major island shudder, to crack open roads, to bring down the walls of a school, and to send a wall of seawater climbing up onto the shore of one of the most densely populated coastlines in the Philippines. The number that arrived first was terrifying. Some of the earliest automated readings put the magnitude as high as 8.2. For a few minutes, across monitoring stations and tsunami centers and the phones of everyone watching, this looked like it might be one of the great earthquakes, the kind that rewrites coastlines and fills history books. And then, over the next hour and a half, as more seismic stations reported and the true size of the rupture came into focus, the number settled. Magnitude 7.8. Still enormous, still the strongest earthquake to strike the Philippines in all of 2026, but not 8.2. That revision alone is going to matter later in this story, because to a lot of people watching, an earthquake that gets smaller in the official numbers looks like an earthquake somebody's trying to make smaller. We will come back to that, because it feeds directly into the central question this video is built around. But hold on to the raw fact for now. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake ruptured the seafloor off Sarangani province, just south of the city of General Santos, at a shallow depth of about 25 kilometers, and southern Mindanao felt the full violence of it. Here is what shallow means in plain terms. The shallower an earthquake is, the less rock there is between the rupture and the people standing on the surface to absorb and spread out the shaking. A deep earthquake can be enormous and barely rattle the dishes, because hundreds of kilometers of solid rock soak up the energy before it ever reaches the surface. A shallow one, even a smaller one, can flatten a town, because the violence arrives almost undiluted. At 25 kilometers, this rupture was close enough to the surface to deliver what seismologists measured as intensity 8, shaking in the worst hit areas. Intensity 8 is the level where even well-built structures take real damage, where older buildings made of brick and concrete block begin to fail, where the ground itself can behave like a liquid in the wrong soils, and southern Mindanao got intensity 8. Think for a moment about what that actually means for a person standing in it. Intensity is not the same thing as magnitude. Magnitude measures the energy released at the source, a single number for the whole earthquake. Intensity measures what you actually feel and what actually happens where you're standing, and it varies from place to place depending on distance, depth, and the ground beneath your feet. Intensity 8 is not a tremor you ride out leaning against a doorframe. It is the level at which people cannot stand without holding onto something, at which heavy furniture overturns, at which chimneys and monuments and poorly built walls come down, at which the act of remaining upright becomes a physical struggle. That was the experience across the worst hit parts of southern Mindanao on that Monday morning. But I want to be very precise about why we're here tonight, because the headlines you may have already seen have mostly moved on. They reported the magnitude. They reported the tsunami. They reported within a few hours that the tsunami threat had passed, and that a tsunami advisory issued for United States territory had been cancelled. And then the news cycle, as it always does, began to drift toward the next thing. The natural conclusion, if you only read the headlines, is simple. It happened, it was bad, it is over. The people who actually study this fault do not think it is over, not in the way you might assume. They are not watching the rubble being cleared. They are watching something the cameras are not pointed at. They are watching a sequence of aftershocks that, within the first few hours, had already produced more than 100 separate earthquakes and several events above magnitude 6. They are watching the specific fault that ruptured, a subduction boundary called the Cotabato Trench, which has a history that should make anyone pause. And they are watching the neighbours, the adjacent faults that a rupture this size can quietly load with new stress. That is the real story. The earthquake everyone saw was the main shock. What the seismologists are watching now is whether this was the end of something or the beginning of something worse. And telling those two scenarios apart is one of the hardest and most consequential problems in all of Earth science. Let me put the energy of this event into terms you can actually feel, because magnitude numbers are slippery, and most people do not register the difference between a magnitude 6 and a magnitude 7.8. The magnitude scale is not linear. It is logarithmic, which means each whole step up represents a release of roughly 32 times more energy. So a magnitude 7.8 does not release a little more energy than a magnitude 6.8. It releases about 32 times more, and compared to a magnitude 5.8, the kind of earthquake that would still make the news in most places, it releases roughly 1,000 times more energy. The 7.8 that struck off Mindanao unleashed, in less than a minute, an amount of energy that dwarfs the largest nuclear weapons ever tested. Energy that had been quietly stored in the bent rock of the Cotabato Trench, across decades of slow plate motion, all of it let go at once when the friction finally failed. That is the scale of what happened beneath the Moro Gulf that morning. Not a tremor, a continent-scale release of stored force. There is a strange and uncomfortable truth buried in that last sentence, and it is worth saying plainly right at the start. We have mapped the surface of Mars in finer detail than we can see the inside of the fault that just broke off Mindanao. We cannot watch it directly. We cannot measure how much strain is left in it. We are, in a very real sense, reading the aftermath of an event we never got to observe in the act, trying to reconstruct what the rock is doing and what it might do next from the faint signals it sends up to our instruments. And that is exactly why the next few days carry a weight that the headlines did not capture. So let me show you what they see when they look at this, because by the end of tonight you are going to understand why the most dangerous hours of an earthquake like this one are often the hours after the cameras have already left. You're going to understand the fault that broke, the wave it sent, the American territory it reached, the swarm of aftershocks it spawned, the 50-year-old ghost that haunts this exact stretch of seafloor, and above all, the disciplined, honest way that scientists tell the difference between a danger that is fading and a danger that is building. And you're going to come out the other side knowing something most people watching the news that morning never learned, that the question of whether it is over is not answered by a press conference. It is answered by the rock, on the rock's own schedule, and the rock does not hurry. Part 2. What actually broke down there? To understand why anyone is still on alert, you first have to understand what kind of fault this was, because not all earthquakes are the same, and not all faults carry the same threat. The Cotabato Trench is not a household name the way the San Andreas is. Most people outside the Philippines have never heard of it. But it is one of the more dangerous tectonic features on the planet, and the reason comes down to geometry and speed. Off the southwestern coast of Mindanao, two enormous pieces of the Earth's outer shell are pressing into each other. On one side is the Sunda Plate, the great block of crust that underlies much of Southeast Asia, the foundation beneath places like Borneo and the Malay Peninsula and the southern Philippines. On the other is the Philippine Sea Plate, a smaller but restless slab moving in from the east. Where they meet, one is being forced down beneath the other, sinking back into the hot interior of the planet along a process we call subduction. The Cotabato Trench is the surface scar of that collision, the seam where the descending plate bends downward and disappears into the depths. Subduction zones are the engines that produce the largest earthquakes the Earth is capable of. Let me make that concrete, because it is the single most important fact about the kind of fault we are dealing with. Every earthquake above magnitude 9 in recorded history, every single one, has happened on a subduction zone. The Great Chilean Earthquake of 1960, the largest ever instrumentally recorded. The Alaskan Earthquake of 1964. The Indian Ocean Earthquake of 2004 that killed nearly 250,000 people. The Tohoku Earthquake off Japan in 2011. Every one of them, a subduction zone. These boundaries are where the planet stores and releases its most violent energy, and the Cotabato Trench is one of them. The reason subduction zones can do this comes down to a single word: locking. The two plates do not slide smoothly past one another. They stick, held by friction across an enormous contact surface, a surface that can be hundreds of kilometers long and tens of kilometers wide, while the slow, relentless motion of the plates keeps pushing. Picture two enormous sheets of rough rock pressed together with the weight of the planet behind them, trying to move past each other but jammed by their own friction. The rock bends and stores the strain like a drawn bow, year after year, decade after decade. The strain has to go somewhere, and it accumulates, invisibly, in the elastic deformation of the rock, until the friction finally gives way all at once. And when it gives way, the bent rock snaps back. The stored energy of decades is released in seconds, and that release is the earthquake. The longer and more completely a segment was locked, the more energy it has stored, and the bigger the earthquake when it finally lets go. Now here is the part that matters about this particular trench, the part that should make you sit up. The Philippine sea plate is closing on the Sunda plate here at roughly 7.3 centimeters every year. That may not sound like much. It is about the rate your fingernails grow. But on the scale of a planet, across a fault hundreds of kilometers long, that is a fast convergence rate, one of the faster ones anywhere on Earth. And speed is everything when it comes to how often a fault produces great earthquakes. Fast convergence means strain accumulates quickly, and strain that accumulates quickly is strain that has to be released sooner rather than later in earthquakes. A slow fault might go 1,000 years between great ruptures, quietly loading, almost forgotten. A fast one like the Cotabato Trench reloads its bow in a fraction of that time. It is, in the language of hazard, a busy fault, and a busy fault is a dangerous neighbour. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology, the agency that watches these faults for a living, the people the entire country relies on to make sense of its violent ground, looked at three things in the hours after the rupture to pin down what had happened. First, they looked at the location of the earthquake sitting right along the line of the trench. Second, they looked at the focal mechanism, which is the way seismologists reconstruct the actual motion of the fault from the pattern of the seismic waves, like reading the recoil and the scatter to figure out how a gun was fired and in what direction. Third, they looked at the distribution of the aftershocks, the cloud of smaller earthquakes that lit up the area afterward, which traces out the shape and orientation of the broken zone the way iron filings trace out a magnetic field. All three pointed to the same conclusion. This was the Cotabato Trench, doing what subduction zones do. There is one more piece of geometry worth understanding, because it explains why this region is so violent and so complicated. The convergence here is not a clean head-on collision. It is oblique, meaning the plates are not driving straight into each other but sliding past at an angle as they converge. Part of that motion is taken up by the subduction along the Cotabato Trench, the part that produced this earthquake. But oblique convergence also tends to break up the overriding plate into a mess of smaller blocks and secondary faults, which is part of why the southern Philippines is such a tangled, fractured, seismically busy place. You're not looking at a single clean fault line. You're looking at a crumple zone, a region where the crust is being shoved, twisted and broken along many surfaces at once, with the Cotabato Trench as the largest and most dangerous of them. When one observer who studies this region described it, he called it a crunch zone, the place where all the plates squeeze up against each other, and that is as good a plain language description as any. It is the Great Crunch Zone of the Western Pacific, and on June 8th, the biggest piece of it let go. And when you know it was a subduction zone rupture, you immediately know two more things, and they are the two things this entire video hangs on. You know it had the potential to generate a tsunami, because subduction earthquakes thrust the seafloor upward and shove the entire column of water above it, and that displaced water becomes a wave that races outward. And you know that you have to ask the hardest question in all of seismology, the one that hangs over every single large subduction earthquake the moment it happens. Was that the main event, or was that a warning shot? There is also a deeper history written into this stretch of seafloor that the experts carry in their minds. Within roughly 300 kilometers of where the June 8th rupture struck, the historical record holds something on the order of 35 earthquakes of magnitude 7 or greater. 35 great earthquakes, clustered around this one violent corner of the planet, over the span of the instrumental record. The largest of them reached magnitude 8.3 back in 1918. And earlier in 2026, this very same region had produced a swarm of smaller earthquakes along the trench, activity significant enough that it forced the closure of schools and government offices, a rattling prelude that in hindsight looks like part of the long restless conversation this fault has been having with the surface. This is not a quiet boundary that suddenly woke up. It is a chronically dangerous one that periodically reminds everyone living near it exactly what it is. Because here is the thing about the rock down there, and I cannot stress this enough, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. We cannot see it. We cannot drill to it. We cannot measure directly how much strain is left on the fault, or whether the rupture released all of it or only part of it. The deepest hole humanity has ever drilled barely scratches the upper crust, nowhere near the depths where these ruptures happen. We can only watch what the fault does next, read the aftershocks like a doctor reads a heartbeat, and compare what we see to every other earthquake we have ever recorded in the long catalogue of our science. That comparison, that careful reading of the aftermath against the accumulated history of how faults behave, is exactly what is keeping the experts watching, days after the main shock, long after the rest of us were told the danger had passed. They are not being alarmist, they are being honest about the limits of what we can know, and disciplined about the things we can. Part 3. The damage you could see. Before we go any deeper into what the scientists are watching, I want to ground this in what actually happened to the people who were standing on that ground when it moved, because the human reality of an intensity 8 earthquake is easy to lose behind the numbers, and it is the reason any of this matters at all. A magnitude is an abstraction. A collapsed school full of children is not. Picture the ordinary morning that this earthquake interrupted. It was the start of a work week, and, for many, the start of a school term. People were commuting, opening shops, sitting in offices, standing in schoolyards. General Santos is a substantial city, a tuna fishing hub and a regional centre, with the dense urban fabric of malls and apartment blocks and commercial buildings that means a great many people are stacked inside vulnerable structures at any given moment. Sarangani and the surrounding provinces are dotted with coastal communities whose lives are tied to the sea, which is precisely why the tsunami threat there was so acute. This was not a remote, sparsely populated stretch of coast, where a great earthquake might pass with little human cost. It was a populated, busy, ordinary corner of the southern Philippines, going about an ordinary Monday morning when the ground beneath it failed. The shaking arrived during the first day of classes for many students, which is a cruel piece of timing because it meant the schools were full. At an elementary school in the Davao region, in the area around Malita, a flag-raising ceremony was underway when the ground began to roll. The whole thing was caught on video, and it is one of the more striking pieces of footage to come out of the disaster because of what it shows about both terror and preparation. You can see the children, small kids, dropping to the ground as the shaking builds. You can hear the rising noise, that low frightening growl that an earthquake makes, a sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A sound that people who have lived through large earthquakes describe as the single most disorienting part of the experience, because your body cannot locate the source of the threat. And then a building fails, and the chaos breaks loose, and the children's composure cracks into screaming. But what is remarkable is how quickly the teachers get the children back under control, keeping them down, keeping them away from the walls and the windows and the things that could fall. These were drilled children with drilled teachers, and you can see the training working in real time, the panic rising and then being pulled back from the edge by adults who knew exactly what to do. Hold that image, because it is going to matter a great deal when we get to the comparison with 1976, and to the question of why the same fault can produce wildly different death tolls in different eras. The difference in part is standing right there in that schoolyard. It is the difference between a population that has been taught what to do and one that has not. In General Santos City, the damage was severe, and it was photographed from every angle, because in 2026 every disaster is documented by 1,000 phones. A well-known fast food restaurant building, a structure that thousands of people had walked past without a second thought, simply came down. You can watch it in the footage, the moment people on the street feel the shaking and drop to their knees to keep from being thrown over, the power lines whipping overhead like live snakes, and then the building folding in on itself in a cloud of dust. What is telling, and what people in the comments seized on, is that the buildings around it, including an older church, stayed standing. People reached for divine explanations, and you can understand why, when one building falls and its neighbour does not. But that is not divine intervention, whatever the comments under the videos might say. That is the brutal lottery of earthquake engineering, where one structure has a hidden weakness in its foundation, or its design or its construction, a weak column, a poor connection, a soft first story, and the building next to it does not, and a few seconds of shaking is enough to find the difference. Earthquakes are merciless auditors of construction quality. They find every shortcut, every cut corner, every aging foundation, and they bill in full. And there is a haunting quality to that airport footage specifically, because an airport is a place we associate with safety, with order, with modern engineering, with smooth floors and bright lights and the routine of travel. To see the interior of one shaken apart, ceiling panels and fixtures raining down into a concourse where moments before people were checking in or waiting at a gate, is to see the thin veneer of the ordinary stripped away in an instant, revealing how completely an earthquake can turn the most controlled human environment into a hazard. It is one thing to imagine an old masonry house collapsing. It is another to watch a modern terminal, a symbol of the engineered world, come apart at the seams. The earthquake does not care which buildings we think of as safe. An airport building suffered serious interior damage, with ceiling material and fixtures crashing down into the concourse, the kind of falling debris that injures and kills people who think they are safe simply because they are indoors. A shopping mall shed its facade onto the street below. A multi-level parking structure rained down chunks of concrete and machinery and air conditioning units. And this is one of the cruelest facts about earthquakes that people do not appreciate until they are in one. A huge fraction of earthquake injuries do not come from buildings totally collapsing. They come from pieces of buildings falling on people, from facades and glass and ceiling tiles and mechanical equipment, often striking people in the very act of running outside in a panic. The instinct to flee a shaking building can be the thing that gets you hurt or killed, because the perimeter of the building, where the windows and the falling cladding are, can be the most dangerous place of all. This is why the guidance in most situations is to drop, cover and hold on where you are rather than to run. The footage from General Santos is a grim illustration of why. There is something worth understanding about why a city like General Santos suffers the way it did, because it is a pattern that repeats across the developing world wherever earthquakes strike. Many of the buildings in the worst hit areas were not engineered to the latest seismic codes. They were older masonry structures, concrete block and brick, built in eras and budgets where earthquake-resistant design was a luxury rather than a requirement. Unreinforced masonry is one of the deadliest building types in an earthquake, because it has no give. It cannot flex with the shaking the way a properly reinforced or steel-framed building can. It simply cracks, and then it falls, often all at once, often onto whoever is inside or passing by. The cruel arithmetic of earthquake deaths around the world is that the shaking itself rarely kills people directly. The buildings kill people. Earthquakes do not kill, the saying goes among engineers, buildings do. And the difference between a city that loses dozens and a city that loses thousands to the same magnitude is very often the difference between buildings that were built to move with the earth and buildings that were not. And then there was the landslide. In Sarangani province, the shaking destabilized a slope, and the earth came down, and 13 people were killed in that single event. Let that number sit with you. 13 people, nearly half of the entire confirmed death toll from the whole earthquake, killed by one landslide. It is a reminder that an earthquake does not only threaten you through the buildings you're in, it reshapes the land itself. It turns saturated hillsides into avalanches of mud and rock and debris. It can turn flat coastal plains into zones where the soil liquefies, where water-saturated ground loses its strength under the shaking and behaves like quicksand, swallowing foundations and tilting buildings over whole. The threat is not just the structures, it is the very ground. By the time the reporting settled into something stable, the confirmed toll stood at somewhere between 32 and 35 people killed, with more than 100, and by some counts more than 200 injured, and those numbers were still climbing as rescuers reached areas that had been cut off by damaged roads and downed communications. The President of the Philippines, Ferdinand Marcos Jr., ordered the national government agencies to respond immediately, mobilizing the machinery of disaster response. And in at least one collapsed multi-story building in General Santos, search and rescue teams were going into the wreckage to look for survivors, while the aftershocks were still coming. That is about as dangerous as rescue work gets, because every one of those aftershocks is a fresh roll of the dice for a structure that is already barely standing, a structure whose remaining columns and walls have already been weakened and could give way completely under the next jolt. Watch the footage and you can see the rescuers hesitate, pull back, react to sounds of cracking because they know what every aftershock could mean for them. And that brings us to the part of the story that the headlines mostly skipped, the part that turns this from a closed event into an open one, the aftershocks. Because there were a lot of them, and some of them were big, and they are the thread that runs straight to the question of whether the worst is truly behind southern Mindanao, or whether it is still, in the cold language of probability, somewhere ahead in the coming days. Part 4. The wave that reached higher than expected. There was a tsunami, not a warning that fizzled into nothing, not a precautionary alert that was issued and then quietly forgotten. An actual tsunami, observed and measured on tide gauges and caught on camera as it came ashore. This is the second phase of a subduction earthquake, and it is in many ways the more feared one, because the shaking ends in a minute but the wave can keep coming for hours. When a subduction earthquake thrusts the seafloor upward, it lifts the entire weight of the ocean sitting on top of it, and that lifted water has nowhere to go but outward, racing away from the source in every direction as a series of long, fast, low waves. I want you to really picture the scale of this. The rupture does not splash the water. It heaves up a patch of seafloor that might be tens of kilometers across, and the whole column of ocean above that patch, billions of tons of water, is suddenly displaced. In the open ocean, these waves are almost invisible. Just a gentle swell, perhaps a foot high, moving at the speed of a jet airliner, 500, 600, 700 kilometers an hour. A ship in deep water might not even notice one pass beneath it. It is only when these waves reach shallow water near the coast that the physics turns monstrous. The leading edge slows as it drags on the rising seafloor, the water behind piles up into the back of it, and the wave that was a foot high in the open ocean rears up into the destructive surge we picture when we hear the word tsunami. The waves from the June 8th earthquake were confirmed at multiple locations, which is what separates this from a mere warning. The largest measured wave, around 1 meter, which is about 3.3 feet, was recorded at stations in Sultan Kudarat and Sarangani, the provinces closest to the rupture. That is significantly higher than some of the very first estimates, which had suggested only a few inches, and that upward revision is part of why the people who saw the water behaving strangely were right to run. At Davao the wave was around 1.5 feet. Across the water in Indonesia, at sites in Sulawesi and Maluku, the readings were smaller, under a foot. As far away as Palau, instruments picked up a wave of about 1/10 of a foot, a whisper of the energy that had crossed all that ocean. The Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology reported that tsunami waves had reached 6 separate coastal areas. Now, a 1-meter tsunami is not the towering monster of disaster films, and I am not going to pretend it was. But I need you to understand something that the survivors in those coastal towns understood instantly, and that too many people watching from a safe distance do not. A 1-meter tsunami can kill you. It is not the height that does the damage, it is the mass and the momentum. A tsunami wave is not the curling, breaking wave a surfer rides, and then it is gone. It is the leading edge of an enormous volume of moving water, a surge that keeps coming and coming, with the entire ocean behind it pushing for minutes at a time. Even a wave that only reaches your knees can sweep your legs out from under you, drag you off your feet, pull you out to sea on the backwash, push you under, and slam you into debris. People drown in tsunamis that were waist-high. The water is not just deep, it is moving with terrible force, and it does not let go. And tsunamis carry debris, which multiplies the danger. The footage from the General Santos area showed exactly this. Water surging into the coastal zone thick with floating wreckage. The remains of structures that had already been damaged by the shaking, churned up and dragged back out and then driven in again with the next wave. A person caught in that water is not just fighting the current. They are being battered by everything the current is carrying, the timbers and the panels and the vehicles and the contents of flooded buildings, any one of which can knock you unconscious. This is why even a modest tsunami is so lethal. It weaponizes everything it touches. Because that is the other thing about tsunamis that the videos captured, and it is the deadliest misconception of all. There was not one wave. There were several, arriving in succession over a period of time. You can see in the footage a wave come in, recede, and then another wave following behind it. And this is the single most lethal misconception about tsunamis, the one that kills people again and again across history. People believe that once the first wave has come and gone, the danger is over, and they go back down to the shore to look at the damage, or to find someone, or to recover belongings, or simply out of curiosity. And then the second wave arrives, and sometimes the second or the third or even a later wave is larger than the first, because the wave train interacts with the shape of the coastline and the harbour in complex ways. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center had warned that waves up to 3 meters, nearly 10 feet, were possible along some Philippine coasts, with 1 to over 3 feet possible for parts of Indonesia and Malaysia. The danger zone is not a single moment. It can persist for hours after the earthquake, as the wave train sloshes back and forth across the ocean basin like water in a disturbed bathtub. There is a particular cruelty to how a tsunami interacts with a coastline that has just been hit by the shaking. The people on that shore have already been through the earthquake. They are shaken, disoriented, perhaps injured, perhaps searching for family members, perhaps standing in the wreckage of their own homes. Their instinct, a deeply human one, is to stay near what they know, to assess the damage, to help. And the water uses that instinct against them. The first surge may come in modestly, recede, and lull people into thinking the sea has had its say. They move back toward the shore, and then the ocean, having drawn its breath, comes back. This pattern has repeated across tsunami disasters throughout recorded history, in every ocean, in every era, and it is why the single most important piece of tsunami safety knowledge is also the most counterintuitive. The danger is not one moment. It is a series of moments stretched across hours, and the safe response is not to look, but to leave, and to stay gone until the official all clear, not the apparent calm, tells you it is over. In the footage, you can see at least one person who understood this perfectly, running for higher ground the instant the water began to behave strangely, not waiting to see how big it would get, not stopping to film it, just going up and going inland. That is exactly the right response, and it is the response that decades of earthquake and tsunami education are designed to produce. If you are on a coast anywhere near a large earthquake, and the ground shakes hard, or the water suddenly pulls back to expose the seafloor in an unnatural retreat, you do not wait for an official warning. You go up, and you go inland, and you do it immediately because the first wave can arrive in minutes, faster than any warning system on Earth can reach you. The earthquake itself is the warning. The shaking is the alarm. By the time an official alert reaches your phone, the wave may already be at the shore. Your own 2 feet moving uphill are the most reliable tsunami defense you have. And then, a few hours after it all began, the authorities announced that based on the available data, the tsunami threat had passed. The waves had been recorded, the ocean was settling back toward its normal rhythm, and the immediate danger from the sea was over. Which is true, as far as it goes, and it was the correct call to make. But notice how that announcement, sensible and accurate as it was, contributed to the impression that the whole event was wrapping up. The tsunami threat passing is not the same as the earthquake hazard passing. They are 2 different threats with 2 different clocks. The sea had settled, yes, but the fault was still rumbling and the land was still dangerous. And to fully understand how this earthquake managed to convince so much of the world that it was over while the experts were still on high alert, we have to follow the wave outward, all the way to a piece of the United States, before we come back to the fault that started it all. Part 5. When a Philippine earthquake puts American soil on alert. Here is a detail that did not get nearly the attention it deserved, and it is the kind of thing that puts the raw scale of this earthquake into perspective for an audience that might otherwise think of the southern Philippines as very far away and the whole event as someone else's distant problem. This earthquake was large enough to put United States territory on a tsunami alert. When the rupture happened, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center did not just issue warnings for the Philippines and Indonesia and the immediate region. Its job is to calculate, in the minutes after any large undersea earthquake, where the resulting waves might travel across the entire Pacific basin and to alert every coastline in their path. And in those calculations, 2 American jurisdictions came up. The center issued a tsunami advisory for Guam and for the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Both of those are United States territories, American soil in the Western Pacific, home to American citizens and American military bases, with American emergency management agencies that had to spring into action. Guam Homeland Security and the Office of Civil Defense relayed the advisory to the island's residents, putting an entire American community on notice that a wave generated off the coast of Mindanao might be heading their way. The projected threat for Guam was sea level fluctuations generally no more than about a foot above and below the normal tide, along with strong and unusual ocean currents in harbours and bays and nearshore waters. The earliest estimated time for those hazardous currents to begin was 1:45 in the afternoon, Guam time, which gave the calculation a precision that underscores just how well understood tsunami travel times have become. The warning center could tell the people of Guam not just that a wave might come, but roughly when. Now, I want to be very careful and very honest here, because the difference between accuracy and exaggeration is exactly the kind of thing this channel exists to get right, and it would be easy and dishonest to turn this into something it was not. What was issued for Guam was an advisory. In the language of tsunami alerts, an advisory is the lowest tier of concern. It is not a warning, which is the highest level, and means a dangerous, potentially destructive tsunami with significant inundation is expected. An advisory means strong currents and minor sea level changes that are hazardous to people who are in or right at the water, in harbours and on beaches, but not a threat that requires fleeing to high ground or evacuating the population. The Guam officials were explicit about this distinction. They told people to stay out of the water and away from the beaches, to keep their boats secured, to stay alert for further information, but they said clearly that it did not call for a full-scale evacuation. It was a real hazard, properly communicated at the level the data supported. No more, no less. And here is the most important part of the honest version of this story, the part that connects it straight back to our central thread. That advisory for Guam and the Northern Marianas was cancelled. It was lifted roughly 2 hours after the earthquake, late in the morning Guam time, around the noon hour, once the incoming data and the actual tide gauge readings showed the threat to those islands had not materialised into anything dangerous. After the cancellation, the only thing that lingered was a beach hazard statement and a high risk of rip currents for Guam, Rota, Tinian and Saipan, in effect for a few more hours, the residual churning of an ocean that had been disturbed thousands of kilometres away. There was no tsunami threat to Hawaii. There was no threat to Alaska or the United States West Coast. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center checked those distant shores against their models and cleared them, one by one. It is also worth noting, for the sake of completeness, just how wide the net of concern was cast in those first minutes. Beyond Guam and the Northern Marianas, the warning calculations touched on a broad swath of the Western Pacific, with tsunami threats assessed for the coasts of Indonesia, Taiwan, Palau, and Papua New Guinea, the whole tangle of islands and seas that surround the rupture zone. That is the geography of a great earthquake's reach, an entire region of nations and territories that have to respond to a single rupture off one stretch of Mindanao coast. Each of them ran the same calculation, weighed the same data, and made the same kind of decision about whether to warn, to advise, or to stand down. The June 8th earthquake did not just shake the Philippines. It sent every monitoring agency around the Western Pacific into motion at once. So why am I telling you in such detail about an advisory that got cancelled, a threat to American soil that never amounted to more than strong currents, and then evaporated? Because it does two things at once, and both of them feed the central thread of this story in a way that is almost too perfect. And consider what it means that the calculation could be made at all. The reason the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center could tell Guam, within minutes, roughly when and how strongly a wave might arrive, is that tsunamis, for all their terror, are in one respect highly predictable. Once a wave is generated, it travels across the deep ocean at a speed governed almost entirely by the depth of the water, and that depth is mapped. So the instant the earthquake's location and size are known, the travel times to every coastline in the Pacific can be computed with real precision. This is one of the genuine triumphs of modern earth science, the ability to turn a sudden, violent, unpredictable rupture into a set of concrete arrival times for shores thousands of kilometres away, in time for people to act. It is the exact capability that 1976 did not have, and it is part of why the same fault produced such different outcomes in the two eras. The wave is just as fast. We are just no longer blind to it. First, it shows you the reach. An earthquake on a fault most people have never heard of, off the coast of an island many people could not find on a map, was powerful enough that within minutes the warning systems were calculating wave arrival times for American territory thousands of kilometres across the open Pacific. That is the scale of energy we're talking about. That is what a magnitude 7.8 on a subduction zone does. It does not respect borders or distance. It sends its signature racing across an entire ocean, and serious people in serious agencies have to take it seriously the moment it happens, because they cannot know in the first minutes whether the wave heading for Guam will be a foot or 10 feet. They have to assume and prepare for the worst case until the data tells them otherwise. And second, the cancellation of the Guam advisory is a perfect, almost textbook example of the exact pattern this whole video is about, the pattern of premature closure. A piece of the danger was real. It was announced. And then it was stood down, and the standing down generates a powerful feeling of resolution, a sense that the system worked and the danger has been dispatched. The tsunami threat passes, the Guam advisory is cancelled, the headlines update to say the danger is over, and each one of those true statements, each one individually accurate, quietly stacks up to reinforce a conclusion that is not actually correct, the conclusion that the event is finished. But the seismologists watching the Cotabato Trench were not looking at Guam, and they were not looking at the tide gauges that had just been cleared. They were looking at something else entirely, a list that was getting longer by the minute, a list of aftershocks. And that list is where the real story of the next few days was being written, in real time, while the rest of the world was being told it could relax. Part 6, 138, and counting. Let me give you the number that the experts were actually watching, the one that almost none of the early headlines led with, the number that tells you why this story is not in the past tense. By 11 o'clock in the morning, local time, just a few hours after the main shock, the Philippine Institute of Volcanology and Seismology had recorded 138 aftershocks. 138, in a single morning, ranging from tiny tremors at magnitude 1.3, the kind you would never feel and that only the instruments detect, all the way up to a substantial magnitude 6.7. And it was not slowing in any way that would let anyone relax. Within roughly the first 90 minutes after the main rupture, the United States Geological Survey had already logged aftershocks of magnitude 6.5, 6.0, and another 6.0, followed by a steady drumbeat of magnitude 5 events clustered just south of Sarangani, right along the broken zone. Observers tracking the sequence in real time, watching the seismograph feeds, counted at least 3 separate magnitude 6 aftershocks through the day, on top of countless smaller ones, the 4s and the 5s that arrived so frequently they became hard to keep track of. I want you to sit with what a magnitude 6 aftershock actually is, because the word aftershock is one of the most misleading terms in the public vocabulary of disasters. The word makes these sound like minor rattles, like the building creaking and settling after the real event has passed, like the diminishing echo of something that is already over. They are nothing of the kind. A magnitude 6 earthquake, all on its own, with no main shock before it, is a serious and potentially deadly earthquake. There are countries that have lost thousands of people to a single magnitude 6. The difference between a magnitude 6 and the magnitude 7.8 main shock is, in terms of energy, very large, because the magnitude scale is logarithmic and each whole step represents roughly 32 times more energy. But a magnitude 6 is still an enormous release, more than enough to collapse a vulnerable building, more than enough to kill. To have 3 or more of them strike the same already devastated region within hours of the main rupture is not a footnote to the disaster. It is a second, third, and fourth assault on a landscape that is already broken. And think about what those aftershocks are landing on. They are landing on buildings that are already cracked, already weakened, already half collapsed from the main shock. They are landing on slopes already destabilized, already primed to slide. A structure that survived the 7.8 with hidden damage, with a fractured column or a compromised joint, might stand for an hour and then come down in a magnitude 6 aftershock that, on an undamaged building, would have done nothing. This is the cumulative grinding cruelty of an aftershock sequence. The main shock does the initial damage, and then the aftershocks finish the job, finding and exploiting every weakness the first event created. This is precisely why those search and rescue teams going into the collapsed buildings in General Santos were in such acute danger. They were not working in the aftermath of an earthquake. They were working inside the ongoing blast radius of a sequence that kept firing, hour after hour, with no way to know when the next big one would come or how big it would be. And there is a detail in that aftershock sequence that is almost cinematic in how much it tells you about the sheer violence of what was happening down there. At some point after one of the large aftershocks, around the magnitude 6.5 mark, a Philippine seismic monitoring station went offline. The very instrument whose job was to watch the earthquake stopped reporting, knocked out in the middle of the sequence it was meant to record. Think about that for a moment. The shaking was severe enough, or the disruption to power and communications widespread enough, That part of the monitoring network meant to keep watch over this fault simply went dark, right at the moment it was needed most. An observer watching the feeds noted the station drop out and had to go looking for an alternative. It is a small thing in the scope of a disaster that killed dozens of people, but it is a vivid illustration of a larger and somewhat humbling truth. The forces in play here are large enough to blind the very systems we build to understand them. We are watching a process that can knock out our ability to watch it. It is worth understanding why a single great earthquake produces so many aftershocks in the first place, because it reframes how you think about the whole sequence. When the main shock ruptured, it did not just relieve stress. In the process of slipping, it violently rearranged the stress in all the rock surrounding the rupture. Think of the fault zone after a great earthquake as a region of crust that has been suddenly and dramatically reshaped, full of newly concentrated stresses at the edges of the slip, full of smaller faults and fractures that have been pushed past their own breaking points by the main event. Every one of those smaller failures is an aftershock. The main shock essentially shattered the equilibrium of an enormous volume of rock, and the aftershocks are that rock finding a new, messier equilibrium, fracture by fracture, over days and weeks. The more violent the main shock, the larger the disturbed volume, and the longer and more energetic the aftershock sequence needed to settle it. A magnitude 7.8 disturbs a truly enormous volume of crust. 138 aftershocks in a morning is not a surprise. It is the sound of an immense region of broken rock groaning its way toward a new arrangement. So this is the picture the seismologists were holding, while the rest of the world was reading that the tsunami threat had passed and the Guam advisory had been cancelled. Not a finished event, neatly concluded and ready to be filed away. An active, energetic, ongoing sequence. A fault that had ruptured in a magnitude 7.8 and was now firing off magnitude 6 aftershocks and hundreds of smaller ones, with the official scientific guidance from PHYVOLCS being explicit and sobering. Aftershocks were expected near the epicenter, and they could persist not for hours, but for days, and potentially for weeks. The danger was not in the past tense, it was in the present and the future tense. And that picture raises the question that every seismologist in the world has to confront when they see a sequence like this. The question that has no easy answer and enormous life and death consequences. When you are looking at a magnitude 7.8 followed by a swarm of magnitude 6s, how do you tell the difference between an aftershock sequence that is winding down, releasing the last of its energy and fading toward quiet, and one that is winding up, building toward something even bigger? Because in the first hours and days, those two completely different futures can look almost identical, and getting the read right is one of the most consequential judgments anyone in earth science is ever asked to make. Part 7. The question that haunts every great earthquake. This is the heart of it. This is the question the experts are actually wrestling with, the reason they are still watching when the cameras have gone home and the headlines have moved on. When a large earthquake is followed by a swarm of smaller ones, there are two completely different stories that can be unfolding beneath your feet, and in the first hours and days they can look maddeningly, dangerously similar. In the first story, the most common one by far, the big earthquake was the main shock. It was the main event. It released the strain that had built up on that segment of the fault over the preceding decades, and the aftershocks are simply the crust around the rupture settling into its new arrangement, redistributing the leftover stress in smaller increments, finding a new equilibrium after the violent reorganization. In this story, the aftershocks follow a beautifully predictable pattern that we will examine in detail in a moment. They get less frequent over time, and they get smaller. The energy bleeds out of the system, the sequence decays, steadily and reliably, like the dying vibrations of a struck bell. The danger gradually, steadily fades into the background. This is what the overwhelming majority of large earthquakes do, and it is the most likely future for Mindanao. In the second story, the one nobody wants to be true, the big earthquake was not the main shock at all. It was a foreshock. It was the largest in a series of warning tremors that precede an even bigger rupture still to come. In this story, what looks like an ordinary decaying aftershock sequence is actually the fault continuing to fail in stages, the early stress release of a much larger rupture that is still building. And the nightmare, the thing that robs seismologists of sleep, is that in the early hours, the foreshock scenario and the ordinary aftershock scenario produce data that can look frustratingly alike. A magnitude 7.8 followed by a string of magnitude 6s could be the normal, healthy decay of a main shock that has done its work. Or it could be the unstable rumbling of a fault that is not finished, that is loading toward a release that would dwarf the first event. You are looking at the same kind of data, and it could mean two opposite things. And I want to be honest about how rare the second story actually is, because the rarity is itself important. Studies of large earthquakes suggest that only a small percentage of them, commonly estimated in the single digits of percent, turn out to be foreshocks to something larger. The overwhelming majority of major earthquakes are main shocks. So when a seismologist holds open the possibility that a 7.8 might be a foreshock, they are not saying it is likely. They are saying it belongs to a small but real category that has produced some of the worst disasters on record, and that the cost of being wrong in that direction is so catastrophic that the possibility cannot be dismissed even when it is improbable. This is the logic of tail risk, the same logic that makes us take seriously the small chance of a rare catastrophic event when the consequences would be unbearable. Low probability, but you still keep watching, because the one time in many that it happens, it is Tohoku. We are not speculating wildly when we raise this possibility. We are remembering. Because the world has watched the second story play out in living memory, and it was one of the most catastrophic natural disasters of the modern era. In March of 2011, off the coast of northeastern Japan, a magnitude 7.3 earthquake struck. By any normal standard, a magnitude 7.3 is a major earthquake, a main shock in its own right, the kind of event that would headline the news anywhere in the world. Japanese seismologists, who are among the best and most sophisticated in the world, who have studied their own violent ground more intensely than almost anyone, treated it as a significant event. And then, about 2 days later, the same fault zone unleashed a magnitude 9.0. The Tohoku earthquake, the fourth largest earthquake ever recorded by instruments, the one that generated the tsunami that overwhelmed coastal defences and the Fukushima nuclear plant and killed close to 20,000 people. That magnitude 7.32 days earlier had not been the main shock. It had been a foreshock, the warning shot that was only recognised for what it truly was in hindsight, when it was far too late to matter, and it was not a one-time fluke of history, a freak occurrence we can dismiss. This channel has examined the more recent case of Kamchatka, the Russian peninsula in the far North Pacific, where in 2025 a magnitude 7.4 was followed by a magnitude 8.8. Again, an event easily large enough to be a main shock in its own right turned out to be the prelude to something far larger, a foreshock to a giant. Two cases, both on subduction zones, both within recent memory, both where a major earthquake was the herald of a far greater one. It is worth pausing on why foreshocks are so treacherous, why they cannot simply be identified and flagged in advance. The uncomfortable scientific reality is that there is nothing about a foreshock, in the moment it happens, that marks it as a foreshock. A magnitude 7.3 is a magnitude 7.3. It looks exactly like a main shock because in the overwhelming majority of cases, a magnitude 7.3 is a main shock. The label foreshock is one we can only apply after the fact, after the larger event has happened and revealed the earlier one for what it was. In real time, a foreshock and a main shock are indistinguishable, and that is the heart of the problem. You cannot issue a warning based on a feature that only becomes visible in hindsight. All you can do is hold open the possibility, weight it by the statistics, and watch. This is not a failure of the science. It is an honest acknowledgement of a genuine limit, the kind of limit that separates real seismology from the false confidence of those who claim they can predict the next big one. These cases are precisely why no responsible seismologist, looking at a magnitude 7.8 on a fast subduction zone with an active aftershock sequence, will stand up in the first days and declare with certainty that the worst is over. They cannot. The history of their own science, written in the deaths of tens of thousands of people, tells them they cannot make that promise. But, and this is the most important word in this entire video, and it is where this channel parts ways completely with the doom merchants who profit from raw fear, raising the foreshock question is not the same as predicting a foreshock. The honest scientific position is not panic, and it is not prophecy. It is something much more disciplined and much more useful than either. It is this. The foreshock scenario is real, it has happened before, and it cannot be definitively ruled out in the first days after a great earthquake. That much honesty is required, but it is also, by a wide margin, the least likely of the possibilities, the rare exception rather than the rule. And for Mindanao specifically, the actual data was not showing the signature you would expect from an accelerating foreshock sequence. The aftershocks, energetic as they were behaving like a decaying aftershock sequence, not an escalating one. The most likely outcome, the one the evidence genuinely pointed toward, was the ordinary story. The big one had already happened. So how do scientists actually tell the difference, beyond gut feeling and historical dread, beyond the haunting memory of Tohoku? How do they look at a list of aftershocks and read, in its numbers, whether a sequence is dying down or building up? They use two laws, two patterns in the behavior of aftershocks that have held up across thousands upon thousands of earthquakes over more than a century of observation. And those two laws are the actual tools the experts are using right now, in real time, to read the Cotabato sequence. Understanding them is understanding exactly what the people watching this fault are watching for. Part 8. The two laws that read the aftershocks. If you want to understand what the seismologists watching the Cotabato Trench are actually doing, in the days after the rupture, you have to meet the two rules they are measuring this sequence against. They are not flashy. They do not make for dramatic headlines. They are statistical patterns, observed and refined across more than a century of earthquake records, and they are remarkably reliable in the aggregate, even though, and this caveat matters enormously, they cannot tell you exactly what any single fault will do next. They tell you the odds, not the certainty. But in a science where we cannot see the rock directly, the odds are an enormous amount of power. The first is called Barth's Law, and it deals with the size of the largest aftershock. What seismologists have found, by looking at countless main shock and aftershock sequences from all over the world, is that the biggest aftershock tends to be about 1.1 to 1.2 magnitude units smaller than the main shock that produced it. Not always, not exactly, there is scatter around the average, but with striking consistency across the global catalogue. It is one of those empirical regularities that emerges from the chaos of individual earthquakes when you look at enough of them. So take our magnitude 7.8, subtract roughly 1.1 or 1.2, and you get an expected largest aftershock somewhere in the neighbourhood of magnitude 6.6 to 6.8. Now look back at what actually happened in Mindanao. The largest aftershocks recorded in the sequence were around magnitude 6.5 to 6.7. Sit with that for a second, because it is genuinely reassuring once you understand it. The observed largest aftershock was sitting almost exactly where Barth's Law says the largest aftershock of a 7.8 should be. It landed right at the predicted ceiling, right where a normal, well-behaved aftershock sequence following a true main shock would put it. And that is, in a strange and counterintuitive way, a comfort rather than an alarm. Because here is the logic. If the largest aftershock is landing right where the statistics predict it should for a normal main shock, that is consistent with the ordinary story, the story where the 7.8 was the genuine main event, and the sequence is now decaying. If instead the aftershocks had been creeping upward over time, getting bigger rather than smaller, approaching or matching or exceeding the size of the original event, that would be the alarming signature. That upward creep is the fingerprint of a fault that might be building rather than releasing. The data pattern that would have a seismologist reaching for the phone. The Mindanao sequence was not doing that. Its largest aftershock was behaving itself, statistically speaking, sitting right at the expected ceiling and not pushing past it. That single fact, that the biggest aftershock landed where Barth's Law said it would, is a big part of why the overall assessment leaned toward this being a normal, if violent and deadly aftershock sequence rather than the prelude to something larger. The second law is called Omori's Law, and it deals with timing rather than size. Where Barth's Law tells you how big the largest aftershock should be, Omori's Law tells you how the aftershocks are distributed in time. What Omori's Law describes is the rate at which aftershocks occur, and the pattern, again observed across enormous numbers of sequences, is that the rate decays in a very particular mathematical way. Aftershocks are most frequent immediately after the main shock, and then their frequency drops off rapidly, roughly in proportion to one divided by the time elapsed since the main shock. In plain language, strip away the mathematics, and it means this. The first day has the most aftershocks, the second day has noticeably fewer, a week out fewer still, a month out the rate has dropped dramatically toward the background level. The decay is steep at the start and then long-tailed, which is why a big earthquake can still produce the occasional aftershock months or even years later. but the dangerous, dense, large aftershocks are heavily concentrated in those first hours and days. And this is exactly why, if you were paying attention to the coverage, you kept hearing about a window of the next 24 to 72 hours. That number is not arbitrary. It is not a figure someone invented to sound precise. It comes straight out of Omori's law. The first 1 to 3 days after a magnitude 7.8 are when the aftershock rate is highest, which means they are also when the probability of a large damaging aftershock is highest, because more aftershocks overall means more chances for a big one among them. It is the period when an already damaged region is most likely to be hit again hard, when the rescue workers are in the most danger, when the people whose homes are cracked absolutely should not go back inside to retrieve belongings, when the entire elevated hazard is concentrated. After that window, if the sequence keeps behaving normally and following Omori's law, the rate and the risk both drop off together. The danger does not vanish entirely, the longtail sees to that, but it recedes from acute to manageable. What is remarkable about both of these laws is that they were discovered not through some deep theory of how rock breaks, but through sheer patient observation, by people poring over earthquake catalogues and noticing the patterns that emerged from the chaos. Omori's law dates back to the 1890s, more than a century ago, derived from the aftershock sequences of large Japanese earthquakes. Barth's law came later, from the systematic study of main shock and aftershock pairs around the world. Neither one tells you why the rock behaves this way at a fundamental level, and that is part of their power and their humility. They are empirical truths, patterns that have held up across thousands of sequences on every kind of fault in every part of the world, reliable enough to base real decisions on, even though the deepest physics of why aftershocks decay just so, or why the largest one sits just so far below the main shock, is still an area of active research. The experts watching Mindanao are leaning on more than a century of accumulated observation, the distilled experience of every aftershock sequence ever carefully recorded, applied in real time to a fault off the coast of an island in the days after it broke. So put the two laws together and you can see exactly, precisely, what the experts are doing as they watch the Cotabato Trench. They are watching the size of each new large aftershock and checking it against Barth's law, asking the same question every time. Is it staying below the expected ceiling around 6.8, the way a decaying sequence should? Or is it creeping up toward the magnitude of the main shock in a way that would signal an escalating sequence and ring every alarm bell they have? And simultaneously they are watching the timing and frequency, checking the running count against Omori's law, asking, is the rate decaying along the expected curve, the way a normal sequence should as it bleeds off energy? Or is it holding steady, or worse, accelerating, in a way that would be a profound red flag? For Mindanao, in the crucial first day, the answers to both questions were the reassuring ones. The largest aftershock was where it should be. The sequence had the shape of a decay. But, and here is exactly why they keep watching rather than declaring victory and going home, those laws are statistical, not deterministic. They describe what is most likely across many earthquakes, the behavior of the crowd, not the guaranteed fate of any single individual fault. They cannot promise what one specific rupture off Mindanao will do tomorrow morning. They shift the odds heavily toward the ordinary outcome, and that is genuinely valuable, but they do not close the door entirely. Which is why the watching continues through the whole window, and why the next thing the experts are watching is not even the broken fault itself, but its neighbours, the adjacent faults that a rupture this size can quietly and invisibly load with new and dangerous stress. Part 9. The Neighbours. When a fault the size of the Cotabato Trench ruptures in a magnitude 7.8, it does not just affect itself. It reaches out through the solid rock and touches everything around it. And this is the third thing the seismologists are watching, the part of the hazard that extends well beyond the epicenter and well beyond the aftershock sequence on the fault that actually broke. It is in some ways the most unsettling part, because it is the least visible. The principle is called stress transfer, and it is one of the more profound and disquieting ideas in all of earthquake science, because it explains how one earthquake can quietly set the stage for another, sometimes nearby, sometimes surprisingly far away, sometimes years later. Here is how it works, and it is worth taking slowly. The crust is not a collection of isolated faults sitting independently in the rock, each minding its own business. It is a single, interconnected, stressed system, like a sheet of cracked glass held tightly in a frame, with forces running through the whole of it. When one crack in that glass slips, the stress it had been holding does not simply vanish into nothing. energy and stress are conserved. They get redistributed to the surrounding material. Some neighbouring areas have their stress relieved by the slip, pulled back from the edge of failure, made safer. But others have stress added to them, pushed closer to their own breaking point. A large rupture can take a neighbouring fault segment that was decades away from failing on its own and load it with enough additional stress to bring its rupture forward in time, sometimes by a little, occasionally by a great deal. Scientists do not just hand-wave about this, they model it quantitatively with real rigour. The technique is called Coulomb stress transfer modelling, and it lets them map out, in the days after a large earthquake, which surrounding faults have been pushed toward failure and which have been relaxed, by calculating in detail how the rupture changed the stress field in the rock around it. They can produce maps with lobes of increased stress and lobes of decreased stress radiating out from the rupture. It is legitimate, established, quantitative science, and it is exactly the kind of analysis that gets run in the hours and days after a major earthquake to figure out where the elevated risk has now migrated to. It is part of what those experts are doing while the rest of us think it is over. So which neighbours are they watching around Mindanao, in this particular tangled and violent corner of the planet? There are three that matter most. To the east lies the Philippine Trench, another major subduction zone, one fully capable of producing great earthquakes in its own right, and one that has been showing swarms of seismic activity in recent times. To the northwest lies the Manila Trench, yet another subduction system, periodically restless and capable of large damaging earthquakes that would threaten heavily populated parts of the Philippines, including regions far more populous than southern Mindanao. And to the south lies the broader Molucca Sea region, which is one of the most tectonically complex and bizarre places on the entire planet. A zone where pieces of crust are colliding from multiple directions at once, where the geology is so tangled that it almost defies simple description. A magnitude 7.8 on the Cotabato Trench redistributes stress across this whole knotted neighbourhood, and the honest, sober question the modellers are asking is whether any of those neighbours got pushed meaningfully closer to its own rupture. Now I have to be careful and precise once again, because stress transfer is also a concept that gets wildly, irresponsibly abused by people who want to claim that every earthquake is about to trigger a global chain reaction, a domino fall of catastrophes around the world. So let me draw the line clearly. The honest version of stress transfer is bounded and modest. It says that a rupture raises the near-term probability on specific geographically adjacent faults by some amount, often a small amount. It does not say that any of those faults will definitely rupture. It does not predict a specific follow-on earthquake at a specific place and time. Most stress transfer increases are small in absolute terms, and most loaded faults do not rush to fail just because their probability ticked up. A fault that was a century from rupturing and gets brought forward to 95 years is more dangerous technically, but you would never notice in a human lifetime. The increased probability is real, but it is usually modest, and crucially, it applies to the actual neighbours, the faults within physical reach of the stress change, not to faults on the other side of the world. There is also a quieter, more reassuring side to the stress transfer picture that rarely gets mentioned, because it does not make for frightening headlines. When a fault ruptures, it does not only load its neighbours, it also relieves stress on some of them, and it relieves an enormous amount of stress on the very segment that broke. The patch of the Cotabato Trench that slipped in the magnitude 7.8 has, for that segment, released the strain it had been accumulating, possibly for decades. That particular piece of fault is now, in a real sense, safer than it was the day before the earthquake, because it has spent its stored energy. The danger does not lie in the rupture replaying itself in the same spot. It lies in whether the rupture stopped short of the end of the locked zone, leaving an adjacent unbroken patch now carrying extra load, the way a tear in fabric concentrates stress at its leading edge. That is what the experts are really trying to determine from the aftershock distribution. Did this rupture release the whole locked segment, or did it stop part way, leaving a loaded gap that could fail next? The shape of the aftershock cloud, mapped over the coming days, is how they will answer that question, and that distinction between the real, local, bounded, scientifically grounded version of stress transfer and the fantasy version where the whole ring of fire goes off like a string of firecrackers on cue is going to be enormously important in a few minutes, because the fantasy version is exactly the kind of thing that fills comment sections and viral videos in the hours after an earthquake like this. The science gives us a tool for watching specific neighbours with appropriate concern. The fantasy takes that tool and inflates it into planetary doom. We will untangle that knot carefully. But before we deal with the conspiracies, before we even finish examining what the data shows, I want to take you back 50 years to the last time this exact trench ruptured at almost exactly this magnitude. Because that event is the single best guide we have to what the Cotabato Trench is truly capable of when it deals its worst hand. And it is a deeply sobering comparison, one that sits in the back of the mind of every expert watching this fault today. Part 10, 1976, the same fault, a different outcome. On the 17th of August 1976, the Cotabato Trench ruptured in a magnitude 7.9 earthquake. Not 7.8, 7.9. For all practical purposes, on the scale of these things, that is the same size as the earthquake that struck on June 8, 2026. The same fault system, essentially the same magnitude, and yet the outcomes could hardly have been more different, and understanding precisely why is the key that unlocks both how bad 2026 was and how much worse it could have been, and why the experts refuse to relax even when the numbers look reassuring. The 1976 event is known as the Moro Gulf earthquake, named for the body of water it struck beneath, the same Moro Gulf region off southwestern Mindanao that the 2026 earthquake also disturbed. And what made it one of the deadliest natural disasters in the entire history of the Philippines was not primarily the shaking, brutal as that was. It was the tsunami. The rupture generated a wave that swept across roughly 700 kilometers of coastline around the Moro Gulf. 700 kilometers. And it struck in the dead of night, in the small hours, when people were asleep in their homes along the coast, when they had no warning, no understanding of what was coming, and no chance to flee to higher ground in the darkness. The death toll estimates vary, as they always do for disasters of that era and that region, where record-keeping in remote coastal communities was incomplete, and many of the dead were simply taken by the sea and never recovered. But the figures commonly cited run into the thousands, with estimates around 5,000 to 8,000 people killed or missing when you account for everyone the water took. Entire coastal communities were not just damaged, they were erased. So here is the comparison that should be sitting heavily in your mind right now. Same fault, same magnitude, near enough that the difference is meaningless. In 1976, thousands dead, the great majority from a tsunami that came in the night with no warning. In 2026, a confirmed death toll in the dozens, with a tsunami that reached about 1 meter and was tracked, measured and warned about in near real time across the entire Pacific Basin. Why the staggering, almost incomprehensible difference between those two outcomes, from the same fault doing nearly the same thing? Part of the answer is physical, and it is humbling, because it reminds us how much is left to chance. Not every magnitude 7.9 or 7.8 on the same trench produces the same tsunami. The size of the wave depends enormously on the precise depth of the rupture and its exact geometry, on how much of the fault motion was the vertical thrusting that lifts the seafloor and shoves the water column upward versus horizontal motion that displaces much less water. The 1976 rupture appears to have been configured in its depth and its geometry and its location relative to the coast to generate a far larger and more lethal wave than the 2026 rupture did. The June 8th earthquake, at about 25 kilometers depth with its particular geometry, lifted the sea by about a meter at the coast, a shallower rupture, or one with more vertical displacement, or one positioned to focus its wave energy onto a populated shore, the kind of rupture 1976 apparently was, could lift the sea by many times that. The fault is capable of both outcomes. It dealt a relatively gentle hand in 2026. But it is the very same dealer that dealt the catastrophe of 1976, and it has not lost a single one of its cards. But part of the difference is not physical at all, it is human, and this part should give us a measure of genuine hope rather than only dread. In 1976, there was no meaningful tsunami warning system for this region. There was no dense network of tide gauges feeding real-time data to a centre that could issue an alert within minutes. There was no Pacific Tsunami Warning Centre calculating wave arrival times for distant shores. And critically, there was no widespread culture of public preparedness, no deeply ingrained public knowledge that hard shaking near the coast means you run for high ground immediately and without waiting for permission. The wave came in the dark and found people utterly defenceless, asleep, unaware, with no time and no information. In 2026, by contrast, the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center was calculating wave arrival times within minutes of the rupture, issuing advisories as far away as Guam, putting numbers and timetables on a threat that in 1976 had arrived as a total surprise, and the public, by and large, knew what to do. Remember those schoolchildren in the Davao region, dropping and holding under the calm guidance of trained teachers. Remember the person in the footage running for higher ground the instant the water looked wrong, not waiting for an official word, not stopping to film, just going. That is 50 years of disaster education made visible. That is what half a century of warning technology and public preparedness and earthquake drills and tsunami education actually looks like when the ground moves. And it is, in significant part, why the same fault, at essentially the same magnitude, produced thousands of deaths in one era and dozens in another. The fault did not become kinder. We became more prepared. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what that 50-year transformation actually required, because it did not happen by accident, and it is not guaranteed to hold. The warning systems that calculated wave arrival times for Guam within minutes are the product of decades of international investment, of tide gauges and deep ocean buoys and seismic networks, and the data-sharing agreements that knit them together, much of it built and refined in direct response to past catastrophes like the 2004 Indian Ocean disaster, which killed nearly 250,000 people, precisely because no such system existed for that ocean at that time. The culture of preparedness visible in those schoolchildren is the product of relentless public education, of drills repeated until the response becomes instinct, of a society that decided its location on the ring of fire demanded a permanent state of readiness. None of it is free, and none of it is permanent. It has to be funded, maintained, taught to each new generation, and trusted by the public when the moment comes. The schoolchildren dropping and holding in Davao were the visible tip of an enormous, mostly invisible, decades-long human effort. That effort is, in the most literal sense, what stood between southern Mindanao in 2026 and the fate of the Moro Gulf Coast in 1976. I do not say any of this to minimize the 2026 disaster, and I want to be clear about that. 30-something people are dead. Each one of them is an irreplaceable life and a shattered family. A region is in ruins, its buildings cracked, its people traumatized, facing a long and painful recovery. The relative success of the warning systems is no comfort to a family that lost someone in the landslide, or in the collapsed Jollibee building, or anywhere else. But the Moro Gulf comparison does two essential things for our central question, and that is why it belongs at the heart of this story. First, it shows you the ceiling. It shows you the worst case this trench has actually produced within living memory, the catastrophic version of exactly what just happened. And that worst case is the scenario the experts hold in the back of their minds, the reason they refuse to relax in the first days even when the aftershock statistics look benign. And second, it shows you, with brutal clarity, that the outcome of an earthquake is not fixed by the earthquake alone. It is shaped by depth, by geometry, by warning, by preparation, by all the human and physical variables that turn the same magnitude into vastly different death tolls. The Cotabato Trench fired a magnitude 7.8 in 2026, and the world was, relatively speaking, ready for it. The unsettling thought the seismologists carry forward into the coming days and into the coming years is what happens the next time it fires, and whether the next rupture deals the 1976 hand instead of the 2026 one. Which brings us by a natural path back to the magnitude number itself, and the strange controversy that erupted online about it in those first chaotic hours. Because that controversy is a perfect window into something deeper than this one earthquake. It is a window into why people stop trusting the very experts who are trying to keep them alive. Part 11. The number that changed and why people cried. Cover up. Let me take you back to those first chaotic 90 minutes, because something happened with the magnitude number that generated real and widespread suspicion among the people watching in real time, and that suspicion deserves an honest explanation rather than a dismissive wave of the hand. If you want people to trust the science, you have to take their distrust seriously enough to actually answer it. When the earthquake struck, the earliest automated estimates were high. Some readings put it at magnitude 8.2. People watching the seismographs in real time, including independent observers running their own monitoring setups and broadcasting their reactions live, saw the needles slammed hard against their stops, saw the early numbers climbing into the low 8s, and they braced themselves for a great earthquake, possibly a historic one. And then, over the following hour and a half, the official magnitude came down. 8.2 became 8.1 in some solutions. The European Monitoring Centre moved its estimate around as new data arrived, at one point even dropping toward the high sevens. And the United States Geological Survey eventually settled on a reviewed magnitude of 7.8, while taking what felt to some watchers like an uncomfortably, even suspiciously long time to post anything official at all for an earthquake this large and this consequential. To a lot of people, that sequence looked deeply, obviously suspicious. The earthquake got smaller in the official record step by step. The main American agency was slow to report, slower than independent observers and other national centres, and the natural, human, almost irresistible conclusion, the one that spread through comment sections like fire, was that somebody was downplaying it, smoothing it over, managing the public's panic by quietly shrinking the number. If it was really an 8.2, the thinking went, why are they now calling it a 7.8? What are they trying to hide, and why? And here is a detail that captures the chaos of those early minutes perfectly. One observer, watching the official feeds in real time, noticed that an automated summary at one point displayed the date of the earthquake as 2024 rather than 2026, a simple data entry or system glitch, the kind of small error that creeps into any system operating under pressure at speed. To someone already primed to distrust the official channels, even a typo like that can look like evidence of incompetence or concealment. But it is the opposite. It is a glimpse of the messy, human, imperfect reality of disaster monitoring, where people and automated systems are racing to characterize an enormous event in real time, making revisions and corrections as they go, with all the small errors that any such rushed process produces. The messiness is not a sign of a cover-up. It is a sign of human beings and their machines doing difficult work fast, in public, with the whole world watching and second-guessing every number. So let me explain what actually happened, slowly and clearly, because the truth is both less sinister and frankly more interesting than a cover-up. The magnitude of a great earthquake is genuinely, technically hard to measure in the first minutes, and counterintuitively it gets harder the bigger the earthquake is. The very first automated estimates are computed by software from a limited number of seismic stations, using the initial seismic waves that arrive, and for very large earthquakes those quick automated methods are known to be unstable and to overshoot. Here is the deep reason why. A great earthquake is not an instantaneous point event. The rupture of a magnitude 7.8 can take 30 seconds, a minute, sometimes more, to fully unfold as the slip propagates along hundreds of kilometers of fault. The true size of the earthquake only becomes clear once the rupture has finished, and seismic stations all over the entire planet have recorded the complete waveform, and analysts have worked out the full extent of the slip across the whole fault plane. That comprehensive process takes time. It requires the slower, more accurate methods to catch up to the fast, jumpy automated ones, and for the very largest events it requires careful human review rather than just automated triggers, which is precisely why the reviewed authoritative solution can lag behind the breathless early automated numbers that the live observers were reacting to. And the direction of the revision, whether the magnitude gets adjusted up or down, depends entirely on the data, not on any agenda. Sometimes the early automated estimate is too low, and the magnitude gets revised upward as the full picture emerges. Sometimes, as happened here, the early automated estimate overshot, and the reviewed number comes down to its true value. There is no pattern of always shrinking earthquakes, because there is no agenda to shrink them, and step back and consider the bigger picture. There is no incentive, and more importantly no mechanism, to hide the size of an earthquake that was physically felt by millions of people across an entire major island, that collapsed buildings on camera, that generated a tsunami recorded on tide gauges from the Philippines all the way to Palau. You cannot hide that. The shaking is the great earthquake's own announcement, broadcast directly into the bodies of everyone who felt it. The idea that an agency would, or even could, secretly shrink an earthquake that an entire region physically experienced in their bones does not survive even a moment's serious thought about how any of this actually works. There is no secret to keep. The Earth already told everyone. But here is why I am dwelling on this at such length, beyond just setting the factual record straight. The instinct to see a cover-up in the magnitude revision is the very same instinct that, in just a few minutes, is going to look at a string of recent earthquakes around the Pacific and see a hidden global pattern, or look at a solar storm happening on the same day and see a secret suppressed cause. It is the instinct to believe that the official story is deliberately concealing the real, scarier truth, that the authorities know something they are not telling you, and the reason that instinct becomes so powerful, so seductive, right after a disaster, is worth understanding with some compassion rather than contempt. The real situation, the genuine ongoing hazard, the aftershock window, the loaded neighbouring faults, the ghost of 1976 is frightening enough on its own. And the human mind, confronted with a frightening situation that is fundamentally outside anyone's control, reaches instinctively for a story that puts someone in control, even a malevolent someone, even a villain. Because a controlled threat, a hidden conspiracy, a cover-up, paradoxically feels more manageable than the actual truth. And the actual truth is harder to sit with than any conspiracy. The actual truth is that an enormous, ancient, utterly indifferent fault did what faults do, on its own schedule, and that nobody, no agency, no government, no expert, is fully in control of what it does next. That is the real fear. The conspiracy is, in a strange way, a comfort against it. So when we get to the conspiracy theories in a moment, hold this insight in mind, because it is the key to treating them fairly. The danger that the theories are reaching toward is real. The fear underneath them is rational. They are just reaching for the wrong explanation of a real and frightening thing, substituting a hidden human villain for an indifferent natural process, because the villain is, perversely, easier to bear. Part 12. Earthquake. Weather, solar storms, and the big one. Now let us deal with the theories head-on, directly and respectfully, because after an earthquake like this they bloom everywhere, in every comment section and every feed, and the worst thing this channel could do is either ignore them or sneer at the people who find them compelling. The honest approach, the one that actually changes minds and serves the viewer, is to take each one seriously enough to genuinely examine it, to grant what is reasonable in it, and then to follow the evidence wherever it actually leads. The first theory you will hear is some version of the cover-up we just discussed, that the 8.2 was the real number, and 7.8 is the managed, sanitized lie. We have handled that one thoroughly. Automated estimates revise in both directions. The direction depends entirely on the incoming data, and you simply cannot conceal the true scale of an earthquake that was felt in the bodies of millions of people and recorded on instruments across an ocean. There is no secret to keep. So we move on to a theory that is more interesting because it connects to something that genuinely was happening at the same time. The second theory connects to the sky. On June 8th, the same day as the earthquake, there was a forecast for a strong geomagnetic storm, a G3 on the space weather scale, caused by a burst of charged particles thrown off by the sun a couple of days earlier and expected to slam into Earth's magnetic field that very day. And inevitably, almost immediately, some voices online connected the two events. A powerful solar storm and a powerful earthquake, on the same day, on the same planet. Surely the reasoning goes that cannot be a mere coincidence. Surely the storm must have triggered the quake, or at least the two must share some hidden common cause that the authorities are not acknowledging. It is an appealing idea, genuinely. It feels like exactly the kind of hidden connection that, once you see it, makes you feel like you have glimpsed a deeper truth that the official sources are too blinkered or too dishonest to admit. The desire to connect simultaneous dramatic events into a single pattern is one of the most powerful tendencies of the human mind. But the evidence does not support this connection, and the reasons why are worth understanding properly because they apply far beyond this one case. There is no established physical mechanism by which a geomagnetic storm could trigger an earthquake, and the energy scales involved are not just mismatched. They are mismatched by an almost absurd margin. A geomagnetic storm deposits its energy high in the upper atmosphere and in the planet's magnetic field, an environment hundreds of kilometers above the ground. An earthquake is driven by mechanical stresses built up over decades in solid rock kilometers below the surface. The faint electrical and magnetic effects that even a strong storm induces at ground level are many, many orders of magnitude too weak to unclamp a fault that is holding the accumulated strain of a magnitude 7.8 earthquake. It would be like suggesting that a candle flame held up to a mountainside could trigger an avalanche that 1,000 sticks of dynamite had been straining to release. The scales simply do not connect. And this is not just an argument from theory. When scientists have actually gone looking for a link, rigorously, statistically, across large global catalogues of earthquakes compared against records of solar activity over many years, they have not found a reliable correlation. The earthquakes do not cluster around the solar storms in any way that exceeds chance, and that is the crucial point about coincidence on a planet as active as ours. Earth has dramatic things happening all the time. There is almost always significant seismic activity somewhere. The Sun is frequently active, especially around the peak of its 11-year cycle. Given two phenomena that each occur frequently, them landing on the same day is not a meaningful signal. It is exactly what probability predicts will happen regularly by pure chance. This channel has examined claims of solar and seismic timing before, and the standard does not bend just because the events this time are bigger and the temptation to connect them is stronger. Correlation in the headlines is not causation in the rock. Two big things on the same day is, overwhelmingly, just two big things on the same day. There is a fourth, older, gentler theory that deserves a brief honest hearing too, because it is one of the most persistent ideas in the folklore of earthquakes. It is the notion of earthquake weather, the belief that certain atmospheric conditions, a particular stillness, a strange heat, an oppressive sky, precede or accompany earthquakes. It is an ancient idea, found across many cultures, and it persists because the human mind is so good at remembering the one time the weather felt strange before a quake, and forgetting the thousands of times it did not. But there is no scientific basis for it. Earthquakes originate kilometers below the surface, driven by forces that have nothing to do with the thin envelope of air above. The weather on the surface is irrelevant to the stress on a fault. The same goes for the folklore around animals predicting earthquakes. Animals may sometimes react to the very first, fastest seismic waves a second or two before humans notice the stronger shaking, which can look like prediction, but is really just slightly faster perception. None of it provides any usable forewarning, and none of it has any bearing on what the Cotabato Trench will do next. The third theory, returning to the serious ones, is the broadest, the most emotionally powerful, and in some ways the most seductive of them all. It is the idea that this earthquake is part of a pattern, that the Ring of Fire is waking up, that the string of notable earthquakes around the Pacific in recent times is building towards some great cascade, the big one that triggers all the others in a planetary chain reaction. And I understand completely, genuinely, why it feels that way, especially if you have been following the news closely and watching event after event around the Pacific Rim. There has been a genuinely active stretch. The pattern feels real because your mind is built to find patterns. But here is the disciplined truth, the one that requires holding your nerve against a powerful intuition. The Ring of Fire is always active. That is its defining nature. It is by definition the most seismically and volcanically active region on the entire planet, and it is active all the time, every day, every year, century after century. When you start watching it closely, the baseline level of activity that was always there suddenly looks like an alarming surge, simply because you are now paying attention to what was always happening. And large earthquakes genuinely do cluster in time and space by pure chance, far more often than our intuition expects because randomness is lumpy, not smooth. The human brain is a relentless pattern-finding machine, exquisitely tuned to see meaning, intention, and connection in what is often just statistical noise. We evolved to see the tiger in the grass, and that means we also see tigers that are not there. And most importantly of all, there is no validated mechanism by which one subduction zone can trigger another one thousands of kilometers away on human timescales. Remember the real, bounded version of stress transfer that we discussed. It operates on neighbors, on adjacent fault segments within physical reach of the stress change, over distances of tens or at most a few hundred kilometers. It does not leap across an entire ocean to set off a fault on the far side of the planet on cue. The faults of Chile and the faults of Japan and the faults of the Philippines are not wired together into a single global switchboard, where flipping one flips them all. They are separate systems, on separate clocks, responding to their own local accumulation of stress. And this brings us to the crucial distinction I promised you earlier, the one that separates honest science from doom. There is a real version of more is coming, and there is a fantasy version, and they could not be more different in their nature or their usefulness. The fantasy version is planetary, unbounded, and prophetic. The whole Ring of Fire is about to go. The cascade is beginning. It is global prophecy dressed up as pattern recognition, and it is supported by precisely nothing in the actual science. The real version, by contrast, is local, specific, bounded, and grounded entirely in evidence. It says this: this particular trench has an active aftershock sequence that will run for days to weeks. The largest aftershock could still conceivably be ahead, though the data suggests it probably is not. The immediate physically adjacent neighbours, the Philippine Trench, the Manila Trench, the Malacca Collision Zone, have been loaded with some additional stress and genuinely bear watching. And the demonstrated sealing on this specific fault, proven in 1976, is genuinely frightening. That is the more that is actually coming. And notice something important about it. The real version is far more useful than the prophecy, because it tells you exactly what to watch and exactly where to watch it, instead of just telling you to be vaguely afraid of everything everywhere. The science does not say relax, nothing more will happen, lie back down, and it does not say the apocalypse is upon us, the cascade has begun. It says, here is a bounded, real, elevated hazard in this specific place for this specific window of time, and here is exactly what would tell us if it is getting worse. And that honest middle path is so much more valuable than either comforting denial or cosmic doom, because you can actually act on it. Part 13. What the next few days actually hold. So let us pull all of these threads together and answer the question the title posed, as directly and as honestly as the science allows. The earthquake was bad. What are the seismologists watching now, and is what they are watching truly worse? The honest answer is layered, and every single layer matters, so let us take them in order of likelihood rather than in order of drama. Start with the most likely scenario, because intellectual honesty demands leading with what the evidence actually favours, rather than with whatever generates the most fear and the most clicks. By a wide margin, the most probable future for southern Mindanao is the ordinary one. The magnitude 7.8 was the main shock, the genuine main event. The aftershock sequence, energetic and deadly as it has been, is following the normal, well-documented patterns. Its largest aftershock, around magnitude 6.5 to 6.7, sits right where Barth's law says the largest aftershock of a 7.8 should sit, which is the statistical signature of a normal sequence that has found its expected ceiling, rather than an escalating one pushing past it. Its frequency is decaying in the direction Amori's law predicts, the rate dropping off as the days pass. In this scenario, the most likely scenario, the coming days bring progressively fewer and progressively smaller aftershocks. The ground gradually quiets. The region begins the long, hard, grinding work of recovery and rebuilding, and the elevated hazard slowly recedes back toward the background level. This is what usually happens after a great earthquake. This is what the data, in the crucial first day, was genuinely pointing toward. Then there is the second layer, the one that keeps the experts watching closely rather than declaring it finished and standing down. There is a real, if modest, probability of a large aftershock in the next several days, something comparable to the magnitude 6s already recorded, or conceivably one a bit larger, right at the edge of what Barth's law allows for a sequence following a 7.8. This is not a remote or exotic possibility. It is a normal, expected feature of the aftershock window, and it is precisely why the official guidance is to stay out of damaged buildings, why rescue work in collapsed structures remains so dangerous, why the next 24 to 72 hours carry genuinely heightened risk, even in the entirely ordinary scenario. And I want to be very clear about something here, because it is easy to misunderstand. A damaged region getting hit by another magnitude 6 is a serious threat to human life, even though it is completely expected behaviour for a fault of this size in this phase. Expected does not mean harmless. A magnitude 6 landing on the cracked, half-collapsed buildings of General Santos could kill people, could bring down a structure that the main shock left standing but mortally wounded, could catch rescue workers in the act. The most likely scenario being a decaying sequence does not mean the coming days are safe. It means the coming days are dangerous in a predictable way, which is exactly why the vigilance matters. And I want to name the most likely shape of that second layer concretely, so it is not just an abstraction. In the coming days, the single most probable significant event is another aftershock in the magnitude 5 to 6 range, somewhere along the ruptured zone south of Sarangani. It would not be a new disaster in the way the main shock was, but it could be the final blow for buildings the 7.8 cracked. It could trigger fresh landslides on slopes already loosened, and it could, if it happened to be on the larger end and shallow enough, generate another small sea level disturbance. None of that is speculation. It is the ordinary expected texture of the days after a great subduction earthquake, and it is exactly why the people on the ground are being told not to relax, not to move back into damaged structures, not to treat the cancelled tsunami advisory as an all-clear for the earthquake itself. The most likely future is not a safe future. It is a manageable danger that still demands respect. And then there is the third layer, the lowest in probability but the highest in consequence, the one that intellectual honesty does not permit us to erase entirely. The possibility that this was a foreshock, that the fault is not finished in a much larger sense, or that it has critically loaded one of its neighbours toward a rupture of its own. I want to weight this correctly, because both overstating it and dismissing it would be failures. The current data does not support this scenario. The aftershocks are not displaying the accelerating upward creeping pattern that would be the fingerprint of an escalating foreshock sequence. The largest aftershock landed at the expected ceiling, not above it. By every available measure, the sequence looks like a decay, not a build-up. So the probability of the third scenario is genuinely low, but it is not zero, and the precedents of Tohoku in 2011, where a 7.3 preceded a 9.0, and Kamchatka in 2025, where a 7.4 preceded an 8.8, are exactly why no one who truly understands these faults will look you in the eye in the first days and promise it cannot happen. It is a tail risk, a low probability with a catastrophic payoff. It deserves to be named honestly, and then it deserves to be placed firmly in its proper proportion as the least likely of the three layers, not the most likely, and certainly not as a prediction. There is a human dimension to this layered risk that the statistics alone do not capture, and it deserves to be said plainly. For the people of southern Mindanao, the next several days are not an abstract probability distribution. They are days spent deciding whether it is safe to sleep in a cracked house, whether to let children back into a school building, whether to begin clearing rubble or to wait. Every aftershock that rolls through reopens the fear, reawakens the trauma, and forces those decisions to be made again. The psychological toll of an aftershock sequence is its own form of damage, separate from the physical. People living through it describe a state of constant low-grade dread, a ground that can no longer be trusted, a jumpiness at every truck rumbling past that might or might not be the start of the next one. This is part of what the recovery has to carry. It is not just rebuilding walls, it is rebuilding the basic, usually unquestioned sense that the earth will hold still beneath your feet, and that sense, once broken by a magnitude 7.8 and 138 aftershocks, takes a long time to mend. So what does watching actually look like, in concrete practical terms, over these critical days? The seismologists are tracking the magnitude of each new significant aftershock against the bath's law ceiling, staying alert for any sign that the sequence is creeping upward toward the main shock rather than decaying away from it. They are tracking the running rate of aftershocks against Amori's law, checking that the frequency is dropping along the expected curve the way a healthy, normal sequence should. They are running the Coulomb stress transfer models on the neighbours, watching the Philippine Trench and the Manila Trench and the Maluka Zone for any unusual stirring that might indicate one of them has been pushed toward its own failure. They are working to get that offline seismic station back online and to restore the full resolution of the monitoring network, so they are not watching this critical window half blind. And on the ground, the practical guidance for the people of southern Mindanao flows directly and logically from all of this analysis. Treat every damaged building as unsafe until it has been formally inspected, no matter how tempting it is to go back in for belongings. Stay alert near the coast, because even in the recovery phase, a large aftershock could, in principle, generate its own small wave. Keep the emergency information channels open, and pay attention to official updates. The window of highest risk is measured in days, and it is during that window, not after it, that vigilance saves lives. The danger has not passed. It has entered its second, quieter, but still deadly phase. Part 14. The fault does not read the headlines. Here is the thing I most want you to take away from tonight. The single idea that sits underneath this entire story and underneath most of the stories this channel exists to tell. The fault does not know that the news has moved on. The Cotabato Trench does not read the headlines that announced the tsunami threat had passed. It did not see the Guam advisory get cancelled around noon. It has no awareness whatsoever that the cameras have packed up and the world's attention has drifted to the next event, the next crisis, the next thing. It is just rock under stress, doing what rock under stress has done for hundreds of millions of years, slipping and settling and redistributing its forces on its own ancient timescale, utterly and completely indifferent to our news cycles, our attention spans, and our deep human desire for events to have clean endings. And that indifference, that total disconnect between the fault's clock and ours, is precisely the gap that this entire video has been about. The gap between the moment we decide a disaster is over and the moment it is actually over. Those two moments are governed by completely different clocks, and they almost never agree. Our clock runs on headlines and human attention, on the speed at which a story stops being new, on the arrival of the next thing to look at. It is a fast clock, and it is getting faster. The fault's clock runs on physics, on the slow decay of an aftershock sequence following Amori's law, on the redistribution of stress through kilometers of solid crust, on a window of days to weeks that does not care in the slightest whether anyone is still watching or whether the coverage has ended. And here is the danger that lives in the gap between those two clocks. It is dangerous precisely because it is in exactly that period, after we have collectively decided the event is finished but before the fault has actually settled, when the survivors are exhausted and the responders have begun to thin out and the global attention has moved on, that an already broken region is statistically most likely to be struck again hard. The most dangerous time and the least watched time overlap. That is the trap. There is a broader lesson in this that reaches beyond Mindanao, beyond earthquakes, beyond even natural disasters, and it is worth naming because it is part of why this channel tells these stories the way it does. We live in a world where the speed of information has utterly outrun the speed of events. A disaster can be reported, analysed and emotionally processed by a global audience in hours, while the disaster itself, the physical process on the ground, unfolds over days and weeks and sometimes years. The flood recedes long before the rivers truly settle, the fire is contained on the news long before the burned slopes stop sliding, and the earthquake is declared over, in the public mind, long before the fault stops moving. The gap between the speed of the story and the speed of the reality is one of the defining hazards of the modern age, and it shows up everywhere, not just in seismology. The discipline of staying with a danger after the attention has moved on, of trusting the slow clock of the physical world over the fast clock of the headlines, is one of the most valuable habits of mind a person can cultivate. It is, in a sense, the entire posture of this channel. Keep watching after the world looks away, because that is so often when the most important part happens. The people who keep watching when the rest of us have stopped. The seismologists reading the aftershocks against laws discovered through a century of patient observation. The agencies quietly running the stress transfer models on the neighbouring trenches, the warning centres keeping their eyes on the data long after the advisories have been cancelled. They are the bridge across that dangerous gap. They are watching on the fault's clock, not on ours. They have trained themselves to ignore the seductive feeling of closure that the headlines manufacture, and to keep their attention fixed on the rock until the rock itself says it is done. And the reason it matters so much that the rest of us understand what they are watching, the reason a video like this one exists, is that understanding is what closes the gap on the human side. A population that genuinely understands that the aftershock window is the dangerous part does not rush back into cracked buildings the moment the first wave recedes. A public that understands the real, bounded version of more is coming, as opposed to the fantasy of planetary doom, can stay appropriately vigilant for the right number of days without being either paralysed by misplaced cosmic fear or lulled into a false sense that a cancelled advisory means a finished danger. The Cotabato Trench gave southern Mindanao a magnitude 7.8 on the morning of June 8, 2026. It killed dozens of people. It sent a wave onto the shore that washed debris through the coastal streets. It put American territory on alert thousands of kilometers away across the open Pacific, and then it kept rumbling, 138 times and counting in the first morning alone, with no sign of stopping for days. 50 years earlier, the same fault at almost exactly the same magnitude killed thousands, because that time the wave came in the dark and no one was watching, no one had been taught, no system was in place to warn them. This time, people were watching, and people had been taught, and the systems worked, and they still are working, and that more than any difference in the rock itself is the difference between a tragedy of dozens and a catastrophe of thousands. The fault has not changed in 50 years. It is the same dealer holding the same deck. We have changed. We learned. We built the warning centres and we ran the drills and we taught the school children to drop and hold and the coastal villagers to run uphill. And perhaps that is the deepest thing to carry away from the morning the ground came apart off Mindanao. An earthquake is not really an event. We talk about it as if it were a single moment with a magnitude and a timestamp, a thing that happened. But to the fault, it is not a moment at all. It is a phase in a process that has been running for millions of years and will run for millions more, the slow, grinding closure of two plates, punctuated by these violent releases, each one followed by the long settling of the disturbed rock, each one loading the next. The 7.8 of June 8th is a single beat in a rhythm older than our species, and the aftershocks rolling through southern Mindanao in the days that follow are simply the tail of that one beat, fading toward the silence before the next. We experience it as a disaster, and for the people who lost their lives and their homes it absolutely is one. But the fault experiences nothing. It just moves, on its own clock, indifferent and patient and immense, and the most we can do is learn to read it, to watch it honestly, and to stay vigilant in the dangerous gap between when we think it is over and when it truly is. The question that hangs over the coming days is whether this trench is finished for now, which the weight of the evidence suggests it most likely is, or whether it has one more move left to make, which the evidence suggests it most likely does not, but which no honest scientist will rule out completely until the aftershocks have decayed away into silence and the window has truly, fully closed. Until then, the watching continues, quietly, far from the cameras, on the fault's own patient and indifferent clock. And now you know exactly what they are watching for, and exactly why the most important hours of a great earthquake are so often the ones that happen after the world has already looked away.